When Les Paul's kids opened his vault after his death, they couldn't believe their eyes. Inside was a fortune so big it made them cry. Priceless guitars, million-dollar patents, and royalty checks that never stopped coming. But that was just the beginning. From family feuds to record-breaking auctions, this is the wild story of how a $5 contract turned into one of music's biggest fortunes. Les Paul was born Lester William Polsfuss on June 9, 1915, in Waukesha, Wisconsin. His family had German roots. His mother, Evelyn, had connections to the Milwaukee brewing industry and the Stutz automobile makers. His father, George, ran a garage where young Lester spent hours collecting spare parts. He was the kind of kid who saw possibilities in everything. Even their wooden staircase became an experiment. He trimmed the steps to change their pitch, turning them into a musical instrument. His mother called it clever, though she wasn't thrilled about the damage. When his parents divorced, Evelyn decided to shorten their last name from Polsfuss to Polfuss. Anti-German sentiment was strong during World War I, and she wanted to make things easier. Lester never legally changed his name to Les Paul, but he started using it later in life. By the time he was 5, he was already performing. He stood on tables at Rotary Club meetings, singing, "How You Gonna Keep 'Em Down on the Farm?" A music teacher once told his mother, "Your boy will never learn music." That didn't stop him. At 8, he took apart a harmonica just to see how it worked. Then he put it back together and taught himself to play. By 9, he had built his first radio. It didn't need electricity. It pulled sound straight from the air through an antenna he strung between trees. At 10, he wanted to play guitar and harmonica at the same time, so he invented a hands-free harmonica holder. He bent a wire coat hanger, added scraps of wood, and adjusted it until it worked. His brother worked at a dry cleaner and brought home extra hangers. Les turned them into endless prototypes, testing and improving with each attempt. In 1925, he was playing guitar at a drive-in restaurant when someone in the crowd called out, "Red, your guitar's not loud enough." That was all the challenge he needed. He grabbed the mouthpiece from his mother's telephone and rigged it to a radio speaker. Holding the mouthpiece to a broomstick, he shouted into it to amplify his voice. But that wasn't enough. He jammed a phonograph needle into the bridge of his guitar and wired it to the radio's amplifier. The sound was rough and full of feedback, but something about it worked. He was 12 years old, and he had just taken the first step toward creating the electric guitar. People doubted him, but he kept going. By 13, he was playing roadhouses under the name Red Hot Red. $5 a night was good money at the time, and he was earning it with music. At 15, he created 2 separate stage names. As Rhubarb Red, he played country music on St. Louis radio. As Les Paul, he performed jazz in Chicago clubs. He switched between the two depending on the crowd, always experimenting, always searching for something new. At 17, he left school to go on tour. He played with Rube Tronson's Texas Cowboys, then later joined Sonny Joe Wolverton's band. His big moment came back home at Beekman's Barbecue. He played guitar for tips while a tin bucket sat beside him. Some nights, he made $14, which was enough to buy more radio parts. He never saw music and invention as separate things. For him, they worked together. When Paul moved to Chicago in 1934, everything started falling into place. He played at the Chicago World's Fair, a massive event that put him in front of a crowd unlike anything he had ever seen. At the same time, he landed radio gigs that would shape his future. Chicago was alive with music, and Paul was right in the middle of it. With Sonny Joe Wolverton by his side, he began hosting shows on WBBM in Chicago and WRJN in Racine. During the day, he performed as Rhubarb Red, playing country music that spoke to rural listeners across the Midwest. But at night, his world changed completely. He stepped into the world of jazz, experimenting with new styles and learning how to command an audience in a different way. These shifts between country and jazz weren't just about performance. They were shaping him into something more than just a guitarist. His time on the radio and in Chicago's clubs brought him into contact with some of the greatest musicians of all time. He met Art Tatum, a pianist whose fingers moved so fast it barely seemed human. Tatum introduced Paul to complex chords and improvisation, teaching him how to approach music in a way he had never considered. Then there was Django Reinhardt, a guitarist who had lost the use of 2 fingers in a fire but still played with unmatched skill. Instead of seeing it as a limitation, Reinhardt created a new style that no one had ever heard before. Paul watched, listened, and learned. He didn't just admire these musicians, he played alongside them. Night after night, he jammed with the best in Chicago, picking up techniques and ideas ideas that blended into his own style. He wasn't just a country player or a jazz musician anymore. He was something in between, something new. But more than anything, he was learning what it meant to innovate. Tatum and Reinhardt had shown him that music wasn't just about playing well. It was about breaking barriers, about doing what others thought was impossible. Years later, in 1953, Paul proved just how deeply Reinhardt had influenced him. When Reinhardt died unexpectedly at 43, the music world was stunned. Paul never forgot what he had learned from him, never forgot the impact he had made. And in a quiet gesture that few people ever knew about, he helped pay for Reinhardt's funeral. Les Paul never set out to change music. He just wanted his guitar to be louder. In the 1930s, playing in big venues was a struggle. Acoustic guitars weren't built for that kind of space. Even with pickups, they couldn't cut through the noise of a full band. He tried everything to fix it. He stuffed the body of his guitar with rags, wood, even plaster of Paris, hoping to stop unwanted vibrations. But none of it worked. His guitar got heavier, but the feedback stayed. One night at a small club in Wisconsin, he got desperate. He attached a phonograph needle to his guitar, trying to amplify the sound. It was a quick fix, nothing more. He needed a real solution. And then it hit him. The problem wasn't just the pickups or the amplifiers, it was the guitar itself. By the late 1930s, he started to see it clearly. The hollow body of the guitar was the culprit. It amplified not just the music, but every little vibration, turning the whole instrument into an echo chamber of noise. If he wanted pure, controlled sound, he had to get rid of the hollow body entirely. In 1941, he built something no one had ever seen before. He called it the log. It was as simple as the name suggested, just a 4x4 piece of wood with a guitar neck and pickups attached. To make it look less strange, he bolted the sides of an old Epiphone hollow body onto it. But those were just for show. The real power was in the solid wood core. No more unwanted vibrations, no more feedback, just clean, endless sustain. In 1943, Les Paul moved to Los Angeles, a decision that would change the future of music. Bing Crosby encouraged him to set up a recording studio, so Paul turned the garage of his Hollywood home into a creative space, unlike anything that existed at the time. It wasn't just a room filled with equipment. It was a place where he pushed the boundaries of sound. He built his own recording tools, even using a Cadillac flywheel as a makeshift recording lathe. He was after something new, something no one had ever heard before. Over the next 2 years, he experimented with ways to layer sounds, playing with overdubbing, sound-on-sound recording, and speed manipulation. Each discovery brought him closer to what he called the new sound. Musicians started showing up at his studio, drawn by his experiments and his ability to make ordinary recordings feel bigger, fuller, more alive. Paul didn't just play music, he sculpted it. He used acetate discs to capture one layer of sound, then played it back while adding another. He kept repeating the process until the music reached exactly what he had in mind. It wasn't easy. Some tracks took hundreds of tries before they were perfect. In 1948, his song Lover shocked the industry. It featured 8 layers of guitar, all played by him. The sound was unlike anything before it. Columbia Records didn't know what to do with it, so they rejected it. But Capitol Records saw the vision, and when the song was released, it became a hit. What Paul was doing in his garage wasn't just about making music. He was changing the way music was made. His techniques became the foundation for multi-track recording, something that would soon become standard in the industry. While he was building his legacy as an innovator, he was also making history as a performer. In 1945, he recorded It's Been a Long, Long Time with Bing Crosby. The war had just ended, and people were reuniting with their loved ones after years of separation. The song captured that feeling perfectly. Paul's guitar work was subtle but full of warmth, adding a depth that made Crosby's voice shine even more. When the song was released, it didn't just reach the top of the Billboard charts. It stayed there for weeks. Crosby saw something special in Paul, not just as a musician, but as a pioneer. In 1948, he gave Paul an Ampex model 200A reel-to-reel tape recorder, one of the first commercially available machines of its kind. Paul immediately took it apart and rebuilt it, adding an extra playback head that allowed him to record multiple tracks without erasing previous ones. This wasn't just another experiment. It was a breakthrough that would change music forever. Then, just as everything seemed to be falling into place, disaster struck. On January 13, 1948, Paul was driving through Oklahoma when an ice storm turned the road into a sheet of glass. His car skidded, then crashed. His right arm and elbow were shattered. Doctors told him they had no choice choice but to amputate. For a guitarist, there was no worse news, but Paul refused. Instead, he convinced the surgeons to set his arm at a permanent angle, one that would allow him to keep playing. It was a painful choice, but there was no hesitation. Music was his life, and he wasn't about to give it up. Recovery took more than a year. He couldn't play, but he could think. Lying in a hospital bed, he mapped out new ideas for recording. He had already been experimenting with multi-track techniques, but now he had time to perfect them in his mind before he could apply them in real life. Then there was Mary Ford. She grew up in a musical family and had a voice that could turn any melody into something special. In 1945, country singer Gene Autry introduced her to Les Paul, a guitarist who was already making a name for himself. Les saw something in her, not just as a singer, but as a perfect match for his musical vision. They started working together, and over time, their connection became something more. By 1949, they were married. Their personal and professional lives were now completely intertwined. In the early 1950s, they became one of the biggest acts in music. Between 1950 and 1957, they had 28 charting hits. Songs like How High the Moon and Vaya con Dios dominated the airwaves, each staying at #1 for weeks. In 1951 alone, they sold 6 million records. Their sound was unlike anything else at the time. Les didn't just play guitar, he layered it, manipulated it, and turned it into something almost orchestral. Mary's voice wasn't just a melody, it was multiplied, harmonized with itself, and shaped into something bigger than one person could ever sing live. The secret behind their sound wasn't just talent, it was technology. Les Paul was always experimenting, always trying to push the limits of what music could be. He played with tape speeds, overdubbing, and sound effects that had never been used before. Instead of recording in big studios, he set up equipment in their home, turning garages and hotel rooms into makeshift recording spaces. He placed microphones close to Mary's mouth, creating an intimate warmth in her voice. He built an echo chamber into their house in New Jersey, carving it right into the mountain rock beneath them. Every detail was carefully crafted to make their music sound fuller, richer, and more advanced than anything else on the radio. Their influence wasn't just in the studio. In 1953, they brought their music to television with Les Paul and Mary Ford at Home, a 5-minute show that aired 5 times a week. It wasn't just a performance, it was a look into their lives, showing them playing music in their own home. Audiences felt like they were right there with them, watching two people who weren't just partners on stage, but in life. It was one of the earliest forms of reality television, long before anyone had a name for it. But perhaps the most astonishing thing Les Paul created was the Les Paulverizer. He wanted their live performances to sound as full as their recordings, so he built a device that let him trigger pre-recorded tracks while playing on stage. It made it seem like they were performing with a full band, even though it was just the two of them. Audiences were amazed. They had no idea that what they were hearing was more than just live music. It was live music mixed with cutting-edge technology. In 1952, something big happened in the world of electric guitars. Gibson, one of the most respected guitar manufacturers, teamed up with Les Paul, a musician and inventor who had been experimenting with guitar design for years. Les had already built a solid body prototype he called the Log, proving that a guitar made from a single piece of wood could produce a cleaner, more controlled sound. But his idea needed the backing of a major company to reach its full potential. That's where Gibson came in. At the time, Fender's Telecaster was gaining popularity, and Gibson knew they needed a response. They approached Les Paul with a proposal to create a new guitar, one that would carry his name and challenge Fender's dominance. Les was deeply involved in the design, and after months of development, the first Gibson Les Paul model was born. It had a solid mahogany body with a carved maple top, a combination that gave it a warm, rich tone with incredible sustain. Les wanted the guitar to stand out, so he suggested a gold finish. The result was the now famous Gold Top, a guitar that looked as bold as it sounded. On May 20th, 1952, the first two production models were shipped to Les Paul. A month later, he played them on stage at the Paramount Theater in New York, introducing the world to Gibson's newest creation. The official launch followed in July at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. This wasn't just a product release, it was the beginning of something much bigger. Les Paul and his wife Mary Ford made sure the guitar was seen and heard everywhere they performed. Les wasn't just endorsing it, he was proving its potential every time he played. Financially, this deal was just as groundbreaking. Les Paul received royalties on every guitar guitar sold and held patent rights for certain design elements, including the unique wrap-over bridge. But not everything about the first model was perfect. The original tailpiece, designed by Gibson's Ted McCarty, made it difficult for players to bend strings easily. Some found it frustrating. Over the next few years, Gibson kept improving the design, replacing the original bridge with a more advanced tune-o-matic system in 1955. This small change made a huge difference, allowing players to adjust their intonation with precision. Despite its bold design and Les Paul's influence, the guitar struggled to compete. Fender's Telecaster and Stratocaster were lighter, more affordable, and had a sleek, modern look. Many guitarists felt the Les Paul was too heavy and old-fashioned. By 1960, sales had dropped so much that Gibson decided to discontinue the original single cutaway model. They introduced a new version with a thinner body and double cutaways, calling it the SG. At first, they kept the Les Paul name on it, but Les himself wasn't a fan of the new design. By 1963, he asked Gibson to remove his name from the model. Just as it seemed like the original Les Paul was fading away, something unexpected happened. In 1964, Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones started playing a Sunburst Les Paul standard on stage. Other guitarists took notice. Soon, Eric Clapton was using one for his legendary recordings with John Mayall and the Blues Breakers. Mike Bloomfield followed, along with a growing wave of blues and rock musicians who fell in love with the guitar's thick, powerful tone. Gibson saw the shift and made a bold decision. In 1968, they reintroduced the original Les Paul design. This time, it wasn't just another guitar. It was a symbol of rock music's growing power. By the 1970s, legends like Jimmy Page, Pete Townshend, and Slash had cemented the Les Paul's place in music history. The guitars that had once struggled to sell became some of the most valuable instruments ever made. Today, early models from 1958 to 1960 are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, turning what was once considered a failure into one of the most sought-after guitars of all time. Les Paul and Mary Ford were once the perfect musical team. On stage, they made magic together. Off stage, their marriage was falling apart. They had been together since 1949, but by the early 1960s, their relationship had turned into something bitter and painful. In 1963, Les Paul filed for divorce, accusing Mary Ford of being unfaithful. He claimed she had affairs with several men, including singer Foy Willing and a contractor named Donald Hatfield. He also said she neglected their children and humiliated him by openly bragging about her relationships. What had started as a love story filled with music ended in heartbreak and scandal. After the divorce, Les Paul stepped away from performing. Losing Mary Ford wasn't just the end of his marriage. It was the end of his musical partnership, and without her, something felt missing. He also knew the music industry was changing. Rock and roll had taken over, and his style of music was no longer at the center of it all. Rather than trying to compete with the new wave of artists, he turned his focus to something he had always loved: innovation. Les Paul had never been just a musician. He was an inventor, always searching for ways to push sound further. During this time, he created something called the Paulverizer, a device that let musicians control pre-recorded sounds directly from their instruments. His experiments in the studio laid the foundation for recording techniques that would shape modern music. Even though he wasn't performing, he was still changing the industry in ways most people didn't even realize. But while he was creating new technology, his body was failing him. Years of playing guitar had taken a toll. Arthritis made it harder to move his fingers. Hearing loss made it difficult to even listen to the music he loved. For many musicians, this would have been the end. For Les Paul, it was just another challenge to work around. He changed the way he played to fit his limitations, finding new techniques that allowed him to keep making music in his own way. Though he stayed away from the stage for years, he never fully disappeared. In 1976 and 1978, he teamed up with legendary guitarist Chet Atkins to record Chester and Lester and Guitar Monsters. These albums reminded the world of his genius. Even without constant performances, he was still proving why he was one of the greatest musicians of all time. Then, something unexpected happened. In the late 1980s, Les Paul decided to return to live music. By this time, he was in his 70s, an age when most musicians had long since retired. But instead of slowing down, he started playing weekly shows at New York City's Iridium Jazz Club in 1995. Every Monday night, people packed the venue to watch him play. Fans, musicians, and even celebrities came to see the man who had changed music forever. In 1988, he received one of the highest honors in music. He was inducted into the Rock Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, standing alongside legends like the Beatles and Bob Dylan. The ceremony was held at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, and the moment was unforgettable. Jeff Beck, one of the greatest guitarists of all time, had the privilege of inducting him. On stage, Beck admitted something that many already knew. He had learned so much from Les Paul. His playing, his techniques, even the way he thought about the guitar had been shaped by Paul's influence. It was a moment of pure respect, a reminder that Les Paul's impact stretched far beyond his own music. Almost 2 decades later, he proved once again that his influence had no expiration date. In 2006, at the age of 90, he won 2 Grammy Awards. His album, Les Paul and Friends, American-Made World Played, was more than just a collection of songs. It was a celebration of his legacy, featuring collaborations with artists like Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Keith Richards, and Sting. The Grammys he won that night were for Best Pop Instrumental Performance for Caravan and Best Rock Instrumental Performance for 69 Freedom Special. It was incredible to see. A man who had shaped music decades ago was still winning major awards, still proving that his sound was timeless. His recognition wasn't just limited to music. In 2005, he was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. This put him in a rare category, honored for both his artistic talent and his technical genius. His contributions to music technology changed everything. His early prototype for a solid-body electric guitar, known as the Log, became the blueprint for modern electric guitars, including the famous Gibson Les Paul. His work in multi-track recording changed the way music was made, allowing artists to layer different sounds with precision. These weren't just small improvements. They were innovations that shaped the entire industry. Even in his final years, Les Paul never stopped doing what he loved. Every week, he performed at New York's Iridium Jazz Club, playing his guitar and sharing stories with the audience. In 2007, he was awarded the National Medal of Arts by President George W. Bush, another sign of just how much he had contributed to music and culture. Documentaries like Les Paul, Chasing Sound captured his extraordinary life, showing how his curiosity and determination had shaped an entire era of music. On August 12, 2009, he passed away at the age of 94 due to complications from pneumonia, but his legacy was already written into history. Musicians around the world paid tribute to him. Slash called him vibrant and full of positive energy. The Edge from U2 said that rock music as we know it wouldn't exist without him. He was laid to rest in his hometown of Waukesha, Wisconsin, where fans continue to honor his memory through exhibits like the Les Paul Experience. But his influence didn't end when he passed away in 2009. His estate was worth tens of millions, built on guitar royalties, groundbreaking patents, and a collection of rare instruments. What happened next was a mix of record-breaking auctions, family disputes, and legal battles that still affect his legacy today. One of the biggest sources of his fortune came from Gibson. In 1952, when they released the first Les Paul guitar, he had a deal that paid him $5 for every one sold. It doesn't sound like much, but adjusted for today's value, that's around $60 per guitar. Over time, the contract changed. In the 1960s, things got complicated when Gibson briefly discontinued the model, but by the time of his passing, over 1 million Les Paul guitars had been sold. Vintage models from the late 1950s became some of the most valuable guitars in history. A well-preserved 1959 Burst can now sell for over $400,000. But Les Paul's wealth didn't just come from guitars. His ideas shaped how music was recorded. He invented multi-track recording and tape delay, technologies that let artists layer sounds in ways never done before. These ideas weren't just influential, they were patented, and companies had to pay to use them. While the exact numbers aren't public, these patents brought in serious money for decades. Then there were the guitars he kept for himself. His personal collection held pieces of music history. The most famous was the Log, a prototype he built in 1941 that became the foundation for solid-body electric guitars. But the most valuable? That was his 1952 Les Paul Gold Top. It was the first production model Les Paul ever made, and he played it on television throughout the 1950s. When it finally went up for sale, it shattered expectations. It was estimated to sell for $100,000. It went for $930,000. That auction was just the beginning. In 2013, 4 years after his death, Christie's hosted the Exceptional Sale, an auction featuring over 150 items from his estate. It wasn't just guitars. Handwritten lyrics, early recording equipment and experimental prototypes all went under the hammer. One of the most talked about pieces was the legendary Greenie 1959 Les Paul, once owned by Fleetwood Mac's Peter Green and later bought by Metallica's Kirk Hammett for $2 million. Every item told a story, and collectors were willing to pay anything to own a piece of history. Not everyone was happy. His son, Gene, was in charge of the estate, and his decisions sparked controversy. Many felt that historic guitars like the Gold Top should have stayed in the family or been placed in a museum. Gene defended the sales, saying his father didn't want his legacy locked away. He wanted his work to be shared with the world. The fights didn't stop there. Arguments broke out over how to handle the royalties from Gibson. Some family members wanted to reinvest. Others wanted the money distributed. The issue became even more complicated in 2021 when Gibson won a lawsuit against Heritage Guitars, solidifying its trademark over the Les Paul body shape. That meant more money coming in. It also meant more disagreements. Then came the battle over his recording patents. Some wanted to license them aggressively, turning them into a steady stream of revenue. Others pushed back, worried that it would take away from his reputation as an innovator.